Good afternoon and welcome back to my NFL season exit reports. We've covered one conference already, pretty much all the way, but we have one team left, and it's the Jacksonville Jaguars. And this time, instead of going solo, it's my pleasure to welcome SharpClarke to the stage here. He's done a lot of work in the NFL. You see him a lot on his Twitter. You could see his Twitter handle. As his resume says online, he watches every snap, which is a lot more than I do and a lot more than most people do. And that must lead to some interesting analytics and metrics. So here he is, SharpClarke. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Ron. I always love talking football with you, someone with a much deeper set of knowledge than I do, having studied the game for a much longer period of time than I have. So I always appreciate having these conversations.
You know, it's interesting. The game evolves over time, and I've seen it for 40 plus years. It's becoming a really pass happy league. But people who are coming in and willing to do the work like you are right now can uncover some things that us old timers can learn from. So it's a give and take. I think I have a lot to share, but I think there's a lot of people like you out there that with brainstorming, it adds to my knowledge, and hopefully it adds to everybody who watches this or interacts with you along the way. One more thing before we get started. I know you had a career change pretty much at the beginning of this football season. Why don't you tell us about your current work and how that evolved?
Yeah, so this season, before the season started, the guys at 4for4 reached out to me, Connor Allen and Ryan Noonan in particular, and they asked me, they've been saying, we love doing props, we love doing bets in general, but we just struggle with consistency on NFL sides and totals, and we know that that's what you focus on, so we think you'd be a good fit. And we had a conversation, and I just really like their style, I like the way they do things, and decided to join up. And so I've been working with 4for4 this season, providing content on the betting Discord and doing weekly write-ups of all my picks.
That's fantastic, and it gets you out there. I've seen your work online. It's thorough, and I like that in terms of the people that I network with. So on to Jacksonville. This is a team that, as you'll see, I have some favorable things to say, even though I stood on the sideline on it. But there were reasons, as you're going to talk to us about, as to why you did not stay on the sidelines. But I want you first to think back to the end of 2021. Urban Meyer, he left the building. They changed the locks, they changed the doors, addition by subtraction, everything good. And so at the end of 2021, they had the first overall pick in the draft. They had their, right up there. So they had a lot of ground to make up. Where were you in terms of when you first started looking at this team, even before free agency, even before the draft?
I was excited about the Jags from the get-go because Trevor Lawrence basically demonstrated all the traits that I find important in a young quarterback, the types of things that tend to be sticky and lead to elite level quarterback play if they can get the rest of it together. So his problems his rookie year, he had accuracy issues. He had, a lot of times the receivers are running wrong routes, or he didn't, seem to get the play conceptually. And a lot of that can go down to coaching. But the things that he was doing well, he was, reading pressure and escaping sacks, evading sacks. He was being decisive, and he was being quick and making quick decisions that were the right decisions most of the time. And those are the types of traits that I think you can build on. And so, you think back about like Josh Allen, it was kind of a similar thing in his first couple of years. Like, he demonstrated those traits, those elite traits, escaping sacks, decision-making, and quickness of mind, mental game. Trevor Lawrence had those same things. And so I thought, if they can just get a coach that has the ability to put it together, and if they can get a few pieces on offense to kind of give him what he needs around him, I think this could be a materially different team. That was kind of my starting position going into the offseason.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Going back, way back, Troy Aikman, Peyton Manning, whatever, it's trial by fire when you start all your games in your rookie season. The windows are much smaller in the NFL versus college. And I agree with you. I was willing to practically throw out his rookie season. He was getting Doug Peterson. And that's the first thing that happened, really, is that he went ahead, and the first change the organization made is they got somebody with NFL experience with a Super Bowl ring as their head coach in Doug Peterson. Then what we saw is a complete overspending of money, but it was hard to get free agents into Jacksonville for a long, long time. So they spent what at the time I felt was too much money on Christian Kirk, too much money on Zay Jones. They had Ingram in the fold. They had a couple of other peepers. They had an offensive guard who was just outstanding with Washington. They added him. That was phase two for them. And I understand now why they paid so much. I understood it then too, because they had extra money. They had a lot of cap room money. And why not spend it on people that would elevate their roster? Even if they weren't true number ones, they were better than what they had on the roster. And then the draft, they got three people that I really liked in the draft. And this was my 41st or 42nd draft report. Obviously, their first pick, Walker, is a little raw. He had one full year of starting experience at the University of Georgia, and hopefully he'll progress over time. But the next couple of guys, the safety from Baylor and one other guy, an defensive lineman, were ready to contribute, and their stat sheets ended up being really valuable. In looking back at what they did February, March, April, May, did you make these same conclusions, or did you study the draft in detail, or did you kind of wait to see how it would play out in preseason?
Yeah, I don't watch any college football, so my scouting of college players is pretty limited. What I think about is what did the team lack the year before, and how will the acquisitions, including free agents and draft picks, how will those acquisitions actually help the team based on what they were lacking? And in this case, it was obvious, right? They had one good pass rusher. They got probably a second good pass rusher. I know that Trayvon Walker was raw and his impact was very up and down, but he's a number one overall pick. He's going to do something. And on offense, they just didn't have any weapons. I mean, Marvin Jones was the bona fide number one, and it wasn't really much outside of that. So adding a bunch of guys that were at least, pretty decent route runners, like they can catch the ball, having Evan Engram give them a really good tight end option. And like I considered part of the acquisition to be Travis Etienne because they didn't have him his rookie year. So it was essentially like, in addition to the draft, in addition to all these free agents, they were also getting a potentially stud running back. So when I looked at how that would impact their performance, and then a coach, the missing piece in all of this was Doug Peterson. Like you said, not only does he have a Super Bowl ring, Doug Peterson coaxed almost an MVP caliber season out of Carson Wentz, which we didn't know at the time how amazing that was. Now we do. And so if Doug Peterson can get that out of Carson Wentz with not the best set of weapons in the world, then I anticipated him being able to get even more out of Trevor Lawrence, given the addition of all these weapons. So my optimism about this team built over the course of the offseason.
Did you have any preseason expectations as to how much of a jump Trevor Lawrence might make in year two?
Yeah, I actually I wrote a Twitter thread about this. It kind of put me on the map. I became the Trevor Lawrence guy. Okay. My take wasn't even necessarily that he was going to improve all that much. It was that he was actually pretty good as a rookie. And most people don't see that because the numbers weren't good. He was, I don't know what the exact numbers were, like 29th in EPA per play or something. He didn't have a lot of touchdowns. He didn't have a lot of success. But as someone that watches every snap, what I was seeing was him performing at a high level, even as a rookie. And so for me, it wasn't so much that he's going to get dramatically better. It's that he's going to keep playing well and have the natural progression that happens when a good player gets into his second year, boosted by the increase in weapons and better coaching and confidence and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, the game slows down for year two quarterbacks. And I admit, not all year two quarterbacks make the leap. Mac Jones in New England didn't make a leap from year one to year two. But I would argue, maybe comment on this, is that Mac Jones had an established offensive line that helped him along as a rookie, whereas Trevor Lawrence, not only the coaching but the line, there were a lot of problems with the team, and like you said, the team personnel. So the influx in talent, the influx in coaching, and the fact that the team was different from year two to year one meant we hadn't necessarily seen the best of them.
Right. Yep, I expected it all to come together in this season.
So, as many people know, I have these gigantic team sheets, and it starts off completely blank. By August, the back sides are all filled with notes on every game that they're going to play and my expectations. And at the bottom, there are team keys. So typically for these shows, when I've done solo, I've read off the team keys and what I expect. In this particular case, I'm going to put the banners down below, the seasonal keys, and ask you to comment on what I felt were the keys to their season, and then you can add anything in there. The first one is right there, the turnover ratio. My mathematics tell me that in the NFL, a little different in college, but in the NFL, that each turnover is worth 3.5 points. If that really is the case, 20 turnovers, that's what Jacksonville was, minus 20 in turnover ratio in 2021. If their goal was to break even in turnover ratio, they would pick up a whole mess of new points that were just lost just because of turnovers. Did you handicap turnovers at all, and whether that would change year 1 to year 2 for Trevor Lawrence?
My game ratings that I do incorporate turnovers implicitly, just because it's part of what goes into the grading system. But for me, turnovers they can be a misleading stat because they're sort of like an end result, whereas every turnover is really like a percentage of chance that turnover happened, and it doesn't always happen, right? So dropped interceptions don't show up as turnovers, but they're sort of like, depending on how easy of a drop it was, it could be like a 50% turnover. It could be a 25% turnover. So I'm thinking more holistically when I look at these things. And Jacksonville did have a lot of turnovers last year and didn't do much defensively to offset that. And I think with more weapons available and a coach that's helping Trevor Lawrence take care of the football, I did expect some, positive regression just in naturally. Like we think about Peyton Manning, he had a ton of interceptions his rookie year and then really cleaned it up his second year. I kind of saw something similar, expected something similar out of Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up because I believe Jacksonville allowed 30 touchdowns in 2021 and had 3 interceptions. We saw a year when San Francisco had minus 24 turnovers. They had 2 defensive interceptions, and there is traditionally at least a little bit of regression to the mean. And if not that, the scheme better change or the defensive coordinator is going to be out of a job, because that's a big problem if you're only putting your hands on 2. And I like your point that you made about a dropped interception, because we don't think about that. I don't think about that when I'm looking at turnover ratios. A dropped interception was all that stopped the Rams from not making the Super Bowl last year and San Francisco from protecting a 10-point lead and being in the Super Bowl. So those things are, the near turnovers are almost like a turnover. It's another way of looking at things. And I think that's important. That's a really important point. I like it a lot. I skipped one here, and you mentioned it briefly, so we'll go over this quickly. I put it in my team keys as well. Travis Etienne, he was missing, and what I like about running backs with his skill set is that he's not just a straight ahead runner, that he adds value to the passing game. You're not manufacturing touches. Like Ezekiel Elliott can catch the ball, but he runs for 4 yards when he catches the ball. Travis Etienne, like Delvin Cook of Minnesota, like Alvin Kamara and some of these others, I think he has the capacity to make people miss. Is that what you find when you look at running backs, whether or not they have more than one attribute?
Yeah, so I like to specifically, identify what makes a running back good. And the thing that Travis Etienne brings is he does this thing where he convinces defenders that they're able to tackle him based on where his legs are. And then when the defender tries to make the tackle, his legs are just kind of like not in that place. It's like a weird way of running. It's almost like a sideways move that he does with his legs, and it just makes him really hard to tackle. So anytime he gets any kind of space, anytime he's out in the open, this is like a Kamara, like a Dalvin Cook. He is so good at eluding those one-on-one tacklers. And he's also really, really strong. His legs are incredibly powerful. So even when he's hitting the pile, this is the thing that surprised me based on, just looking at him, is when he hits the pile, he is able to push the pile a little bit and get 1 or 2 yards, after that contact. So those are the 2 things that I really like from Travis Etienne.
Yeah. So you're just Watching him in college, he had displayed some of that, and I was waiting for him to get that chance in the NFL. Unfortunately, he didn't get that his rookie year, but the league knows about him now, and his run and pass contribution certainly was a key factor, as it turned out, in them going to the playoffs in just the first year. This is something when I look back at the schedule, but when I was looking beforehand, I said, wow, these guys, Jacksonville, they were overmatched in 2021. Then I looked at their schedule for 2022, and I'm looking, they start off with Washington. They start off with Matt Ryan in Indianapolis. Yeah, they have a tough quarterback in Justin Herbert with the LA Chargers, but as it turned out, we didn't know it at the time. He was playing with practically punctured ribs in that particular game, the third game of the season. Justin Herbert had just been knocked out. Then they played Houston, that they played Denver. Russell Wilson hadn't performed. They played Daniel Jones. There weren't a lot of great quarterbacks on the roster. Did you take a look at their schedule beforehand? Did this factor into any decision making that you made before the season started?
Yeah, definitely. This is actually something that I look at when projecting out defensive performance from year to year. Is a lot of times it comes down to the quarterbacks that you play against. And a lot of times projecting out which defenses are going to get better or get worse is simply just looking at their schedules and saying, wow, their schedule of quarterbacks changes dramatically. It's one of the reasons why I expected the Commanders defense to get worse last year from the year before. I expected the Patriots defense to get worse this year than it was last year. And it was the opposite with the Jaguars, where they were getting a little bit of a boost. It wasn't a huge part of my handicap because ultimately I'm running simulations of all the games, and so it's just the quality of quarterbacks is going to be sort of put into the model. I don't double count it and say, oh, well, I think they're going to be even better. But that was one of the factors that I thought would make things a little bit easier for the Jaguars this year, especially with a defensive line that thrives on getting pressure. They're a little bit burnable by really good quarterbacks, but against bad quarterbacks, that kind of quick pressure, forcing mistakes approach really is what succeeds.
So you run these simulations. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I once I've done as I'm doing my season reviews over the course of the offseason, I'm assigning projected values for next year's offense and defense for every team. And then I run like a simulation program that basically simulates the season a million times. And it uses my expectation for the teams. And then there's some sort of smoothing as it goes on. So like if a team wins as a big underdog, like projected. So like, I'm running it a million times, right? So if Kansas City plays against, Houston Texans are going to win, 10, 12% of the time, whatever. In those 10, 12% of the time, if it's an early season game, that will lead to a slight boost in Houston and a slight decrease in Kansas City because there's just things maybe it was injury, maybe it was we had something wrong. And so you run that a million times and then it spits out, what was the median outcome in wins? What was how often did they make the playoffs? That kind of stuff. And that's what I use to make my season-long projections.
So we're on to the season now. And again, I sat on the sidelines. I realized Urban Meyer was out of the building. I realized they'd upgraded the roster. And I knew Christian Kirk was a good player, Evan Ingram, everybody else they added, and there was value added. But I didn't necessarily see them as superstars. And as is my tendency to play many more unders than overs, I said, Jacksonville looks properly priced. But not to you. So walk us through how you made your season win decision for the Jacksonville Jaguars.
Yep. So when the season win total markets opened, they were at 6 wins, minus 120 to the over. And so I bet that right away because for all the reasons that we've been talking about. And then it moved up somewhat over the course of the offseason. And when the limits were a little bit higher later in the offseason, I bet again at over 6.5 for plus 115. My projections had them around 7 wins. And typically, those season-long projections kind of skew towards the outliers, towards like high and low. So like, the Chiefs and the Bills will get sort of an overly high rating because it implicitly sort of, assumes health and it assumes things are going to go as according to plan. It doesn't push them towards the middle. So for me, it's a big sign when a team with a lower win total, I'm projecting them to beat that lower win total. That's usually a very good sign that they're going to go over or that they're going to perform better than expectation. And I think the reason for that pricing being wrong was that most people were kind of like, okay, so Trevor Lawrence might take a big step. Like everyone knew that Trevor Lawrence had the talent, and they're like, he might, Urban Meyer's gone. They might actually be better. So like let's bump up their win total from what they did last year. Pythag I think was something like 5 last year. You roll into 3, so like we're gonna go to 6.5 to kind of, we're gonna make people pay a couple games if they anticipate Lawrence getting better. But I thought that was wrong. I thought it was basically assumed that Trevor Lawrence was going to get significantly better. And so this number wasn't really pricing in correctly what should be an assumption. It was kind of grading it, or it was projecting it as like a kind of a 50-50 shot, whereas I think it was closer to a 90-10 split.
Yeah. And I think that's where I missed a little bit in terms of that. I knew they would be instantly better, but when you project, like I like your point about it projects higher teams to be a little bit skewed to the overs and lower teams to the lower, because if you look at it, you say, okay, like I prescribe percentages for each game. Maybe the Jags have a 0.4% of winning this game and a 0.3 or whatever. And the lower teams are always going to struggle to get above that 0.5. And then cumulatively, I added up and it may come out to, like mine came out to like 6.7 or something like that. And I'm saying, okay, it's in the ballpark. I like unders better than overs. I'll leave it alone. But the 6.7, to your point, I think is, well, wait a second. If some of those 0.4s don't pan out because, or it increases because there's a key player on another team that gets hurt and that raises their profile, or there's a jump because really this team is improved because the product is improved in terms of the player personnel. It's not that much of a stretch to say that one of the bottom teams, other than Houston, which I had a very strong opinion being actually lower than what I expected, that they could rise above that. And certainly I didn't have a lot of negatives for Jacksonville. I just didn't realize the defense would come together that quickly. I don't know where you projected the defense, but they had a long way to go defensively to get to the average rating that for 2022, and somehow they got there.
They did. They picked up some guys. Obviously Trayvon Walker, Devin Lloyd, Foye Oluokun, Darius Williams. I felt like they weren't terrible in defense last year, but they were put in so many difficult situations by the offensive, turnovers, and by the poor coaching, and by facing such a tough slate of opposing quarterbacks, that for me it was enough things that were going to change. And we've talked before about how defense tends to be circumstance based somewhat, whereas offense tends to dictate its own quality. Yeah. So I felt like there were a lot of reasons to expect some kind of positive regression in some form. I wasn't sure exactly what that would look like. But anytime you have a quarterback who you consider to be in the elite or very good category, it doesn't take much of a defense to win 7 games. And that was kind of the baseline for me, is like, is the defense good enough if Trevor Lawrence is who I think he is, that this can be an average to an above average team? And that was, for me, the answer was yes.
So what was interesting in season is that people we know out there actually were losing money betting on Jacksonville during the year when they became a favorite. Mid-season, they were favored against the Giants at home. They were favored against the Jets, the Denver Broncos at home. They weren't delivering in those games. Somehow, because I usually wait till after 4 games, and then I convert all my numbers to 2022. 2021 no longer matters, because 2022, I think in Jacksonville's case, I was probably willing to do it after 3 games because last season was such a disaster, that 2021. But mostly I converted over. And as I'm looking at my stat sheets, I'm saying, wait, their pass defense is improving. Trevor Lawrence's turnover to interception, touchdown to interception ratio is improving. ETN is having an impact. The turnover ratio is flat, +1, +2. Everything that says that they're going to be about an 8-9, 9-8 team is happening. And then I waited until they were a dog and had a wonderful November and December betting mostly on them until the final week of the season when I actually bet against them. So I'm proud of the fact that I was able to, I didn't make the move at the beginning of the year. How did the year play out for you in terms of what you were seeing? I mean, you took a stand early, but did you also take a stand during the season?
So I took a stand early, and that was up and down. I mean, in week one, I had them plus 4.5 against Washington, and it looked like it was going to be a Washington win by 1, and then they scored a touchdown instead, won by 6. It was frustrating.
Yeah.
And then they had those 2 big wins against Indianapolis and the Chargers. But my opinion relative to market actually kind of shifted a little bit down around that time, because the wins against both Los Angeles and Indianapolis were a little bit fraudulent, because the Colts had no receivers. They couldn't do anything on offense. And we now know that the Colts weren't a good team outright, let alone without their receivers. And then the Chargers game was the one. Yeah, I mean, Justin Herbert was playing with cracked ribs. They were down 3 linemen. They didn't have receivers. Like, it was a joke of a team. And it was really in the second half that they kind of poured it on the Chargers. So coming out of that, I was happy they were 2-1. I was happy that they looked like the team that I projected them to be. But from that point on to the end of the season, I'm looking at my ratings, and I didn't really move them around much. They were pretty much an average team from that point on until the end. And so I was it depended on the matchups each week, whether or not I was betting on them. I wasn't heavy on them. I wasn't heavy against them, because I thought the market had kind of caught up. Okay. But like you, I did lean into them late, because I anticipated them, a lot of the spreads they were getting down the stretch were resulting from I think they had a 6-game losing streak. And so I think perception kind of tailed off towards the second half of the year. And because I wasn't moving them down, that was when I became more bullish on them again.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. They upset Baltimore, and then they went in. They had that terrible game against the Lions, but then I thought they were a disrespected dog of over 3 points to Tennessee at Tennessee. I saw them going in different directions, and then it just steamrolled from there. They got hot. But basically, I computed the numbers, and these 3 guys that they had, Kirk, Zay Jones, Evan Ingram, 2,600 receiving yards and 17 touchdowns for the season. I mean, they made massive improvement in offensive scheme and in confidence, and obviously Lawrence with, I believe, about a 25-8 TD to interception ratio. That was really something. Let's go to the playoffs really quick. I know it impressed me that they were able to overcome a 5 turnover differential to beat the Chargers. 27-24, whatever the score was. They beat the Chargers with a -5 turnover differential. Forget about how the Chargers played it out or not played it out. That really, Jacksonville was impressive to do that. And even though they lost the next game, now we're at the end of the season. Just, where are you now in terms of how the season ended for Jacksonville? It seemed to end saying that they accomplished a lot of stuff.
Yeah, they definitely did. And, by my ratings, they were an average team this year. And that was true from about week 5 all the way through to the end of the playoffs. They were basically an average team. At their best, they could beat anybody, because they have a good quarterback, and they have a good coach, and they have, a somewhat decent roster. But I don't think that they were at any point this season the quality of team that could, make a playoff run and go to the Super Bowl. Like, even against the Chiefs, they didn't capitalize when Mahomes, didn't play. He didn't play for part of the game, and then came back on a hurt ankle. They still were not able to finish. Granted, Jamal Agnew had that fumble in the red zone, but even without that, I think they were going to lose. And so I don't think that they can just run it back and expect to be a Super Bowl contender next year. I think they still need to improve, but they do have the pieces, right? They've got a really good quarterback on a rookie deal. They're getting Calvin Ridley back from suspension next year to boost their wide receiver core. They will need to do something in the draft to, I think, boost their defense a little bit, because they were just getting gashed by good quarterbacks, throughout the year, basically. And you can't be in shootouts the whole time, because what happens is variance, right? And we saw it in a negative way against the Giants. We saw it in a positive way against the Cowboys. But you can't rely on, outscoring your opponents every week when you have a bad defense. So I think they're going to have to improve on defense to be a true Super Bowl contender. But I'm optimistic about next year, and especially in such a weak division.
Yeah, great points. I appreciate all the points that you made there. For me, it's kind of a mixed bag. I think there's more. They're moving up the ladder, and I think Lawrence, a lot of those players are still young and they're going to get better. Even those 3 defensive players you mentioned and some of the draftees you didn't mention are young, and they started a lot of games as rookies. So this is really a good sign. We expect Walker to improve and so on. And the division is kind of a mess right now. Houston and Indianapolis will have new coaches again. And I'm worried about Tennessee, as I mentioned when I did their exit report, is that their offense is a little bit behind the time, whereas you can count on Jacksonville to be a little bit more creative offensively in an offensive-driven league. The one issue I would have moving forward is, here we go. They've got the first place schedule now. So they're going to play Cincinnati. They're going to play Kansas City. They're going to play Buffalo. And they're going to play a team no one else is going to play on the other side of the ledger, which unfortunately for them is the San Francisco 49ers with, a pretty fine defense. So they've got to be better to be the same. Back to your point of maybe they were capable of beating any team and being beat because they were average or maybe a little bit above average at the end of the year. So we don't know what strength of schedule is, and it gets adjusted from week to week. But based on the teams I mentioned, I think we know that they have to be a little bit better.
Yeah, that's downright scary.
Yeah, I hate to mention it for Jacksonville. Maybe in the long run, they should have come in second instead of first. But
yeah, I think the second element of that usually is, okay, so which team in the division is going to capitalize on their relatively easier schedule? And right now, there's a lot of offseason to happen. Right now, I don't know who that is. Maybe Indianapolis. I don't really. I'm going to have to do all that study. But right now, even if you spot the other teams in the division 2 games each, I still probably would favor the Jags to win the division. So I think that you can, depending on what the other teams do in the offseason, who's playing quarterback for Indianapolis, then I think we'll see how it plays out. But yeah, that's a valid concern when you're optimistic about Jacksonville. The other thing you have to watch out for is there's a sort of bettors on Jacksonville late in the year were rewarded for betting on Jacksonville. I think they covered maybe 6 of the last 7 of the last 8, something like that, coming into the end of the year. They also won the division, so division bettors are happy. They went over their win total bettors are happy. The vibes for bettors on Jacksonville are so high right now that I would imagine the market's going to be a little bit high on them for projections for next year, depending on what happens in the offseason.
Yeah, it's interesting because they always play the game in London or somewhere in London. So they have 1 fewer home game than the rest of the entire AFC. At least the AFC gets 9 this coming year, so they'll have 8. So we don't know who their scheduled opponent is going to be. So they overcame a lot in order to be relevant again, and it's good times for Jacksonville for sure. Anything else you'd like to add before we close the book on Jacksonville?
No, I think that's it. I'm excited to see where the futures land. I anticipate it won't be a play for me right now, depending on how my studies go. But if they disrespect them, then I'd be more willing to lean over, because I really do believe in Trevor Lawrence as an ascending talent at quarterback.
I think I'm exactly with you on this. There's no reason to believe that somebody in the division is ready to capture them. But there are still a lot of obstacles for Jacksonville, and we'll just have to see how the offseason plays out. I think Indy is on their 8th round of coaching interviews, so maybe they'll get it done before the draft or something like that. I can't thank you enough for sharing the stage and joining me for exit interviews with the Jacksonville. Maybe we'll do this again. Hopefully we'll be doing some stuff in the off season, because it just flows so easily. So I really thank you. And I thank you for putting all the effort that you do. When I write, it helps me clarify things. I've seen your writing. I wonder if that does the same for you, that as you're writing, you're thinking. That's what happens to me. I'm writing, I'm thinking, and so on. Where can people find you? The season's ending in 10 days or so. Where can people find you during the off season?
Yeah, I mean, if you follow me on Twitter, I post everything there, everything I write, all the content. Usually I do a team by team breakdown over the course of the off season, so that by the time, you're ready for the season, it's all there. But you won't miss anything if you're following me on Twitter.
Okay. Sounds good. Again, thanks a lot. Thanks for everybody who's watched this. Share it, subscribe, do everything. Follow SharpClarke if you haven't already. He's got a large following. He does amazing work. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll be back with a couple of AFC East teams in the next couple of days. Thanks.
Thanks, Ron.